again, for yourself, just loads and loads of grace for yourself, because this is not a report card, right? Where it's, did you pass or fail, how you handled after discovery. I think that what's true is, it's chaos. And I think we do the best we can to try to make healthy, wise choices. And sometimes we don't know what we're doing, right? I think, and so as we kind of put these categories of what's not helpful, what is helpful, just really be gentle with yourself in this, because I think there's things I can look back and say, yeah, I think I would do that differently. And there's things that I'm really grateful that I did. It's a mix of some things that I can now see, like that was helpful, and other things not so much. So as we focus on this podcast on some things that were helpful, just be gentle with yourself in this.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be back with you today with Dr. Greg Miller, Greg's wife Beth, and Elizabeth Hardesty from the talented staff here at Faithful and True. And this is part 2 of a podcast that we started a couple of weeks ago that addressed the things you should or shouldn't do following the disclosure of your husband's sexual addiction. Greg, today, we'd like to talk about the ideas of what is effective and what should a spouse do.
Right. If you're just joining us, just to let you know, there was a previous podcast where we did talk about some of the things that we have heard from wives that they did early on after disclosure that weren't helpful. And so with us is Beth and Elizabeth, and they work with women individually. They lead groups here. And so this isn't just from their own stories, but it's also from listening to the stories and specific, as I understand it, even specifically asking your groups so that the members could tell you some of the things that were helpful or not helpful early on. So as you had conversations with yourself and conversations with yourself, as you had conversations with others, we all have conversations with ourselves.
I have those all the time.
Yeah. Yes. As you had conversations with others and reflect on your own story, what were some of the things that were helpful?
Well, Beth, can I just echo what you said in the first podcast? I think is such an important thing to start with is, and I think in both of these episodes, is just, again, for yourself, just loads and loads of grace for yourself, because this is not a report card, right? Where it's, did you pass or fail, how you handled after discovery. I think that what's true is, it's chaos. And I think we do the best we can to try to make healthy, wise choices. And sometimes we don't know what we're doing, right? I think, and so as we kind of put these categories of what's not helpful, what is helpful, just really be gentle with yourself in this, because I think there's things I can look back and say, yeah, I think I would do that differently. And there's things that I'm really grateful that I did. It's a mix of some things that I can now see, like that was helpful, and other things not so much. So as we focus on this podcast on some things that were helpful, just be gentle with yourself in this. So Beth, do you want to get us started?
Well, one thing I would add, I don't know if this is true for you or the women that you work with. It was absolutely true for me. Some of the things that was helpful, I actually intentionally chose and pursued. Some of the things that were helpful, I stumbled into it, and maybe it was God's divine provision. Maybe it was a coincidence, but I look back in hindsight and go, wow, I am so thankful that conversation happened, or that resource became available, or I found that thing. And so even as you're reflecting on some of the things that are helpful for our listeners, what may be true is some of it is about intentional choice, and some of it may be about some provision or conversation that just came your way.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I'm so glad you said this isn't a report card. As I was thinking about our desire to do this, what I'm aware of is how much I wish there had been something like this for me to listen to. I felt like I had been hit by a 2x4. And, especially when we are in the midst of trauma, kind of unfolding trauma, we're really not sure which end is up. And so, yes, this is by no means like a checklist. This is just like a vision, some suggestions of some things that are really helpful. The first thing that I would say is find a few safe people to tell. Maybe it's even one safe person. And if you're listening and you think, how do I know who's safe? One of the best ways to discern that is it's a person in your life who you sense is doing their work. They are emotionally healthy. They aren't, you just have this intuitive sense they're not going to try to give you advice and tell you this is what you should or shouldn't do. They're not going to get preachy. They're going to hold space for you and just really be with you in your sadness, your fear, your anger. And they're also going to hold with confidence what you are telling. And that's significant as because you've already had, your world turned upside down typically. Sometimes I want to acknowledge it may be kind of the drip method. Maybe it isn't one big discovery, but either way, life's in chaos.
And trust has been broken, right? And
Yes.
so just maintain that confidentiality is such an important piece to know that that person can be trusted.
Mm-hmm.
I would add, because we do talk about safe people at the men's workshop, that it's someone that you don't believe will be judgmental. And also, they're not going to be shocked by what you say. They may be surprised because they didn't expect it, but they don't have that reaction of shock or disgust, because if a woman is struggling with her own shame and she gets that, this is the worst story I've ever heard, or I can't believe that he did this, and it has more energy than just support, then that can be something that triggers the woman's shame or anybody's shame for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Something else that came up for a lot of women I talked to is how helpful it was for them to find a therapist that they really felt safe with, that they felt heard and understood by. We often say finding an expert voice, a therapist who really understands how to come alongside and walk alongside a woman who has been relationally betrayed can be such an important piece. But that, and so sometimes it might be a therapist that you have who is separate from that expert voice. Mm-hmm. So, and that may take some shopping around sometimes to really mm-hmm. find a therapist that's a good fit. I've heard a lot of stories where it's not. And so I think, again, there too, just really listening to yourself and trusting yourself of finding a therapist, finding an expert voice, just some people to really help guide you along this path.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, I know you've heard me tell this story at the workshop, but the first counselor that I saw, I was kind of talking through some of my concerns of some things that could potentially happen as consequences to our story. And his response was, "You think?" Like he scoffed at my questioning. And I am so thankful I walked out of there and fired that counselor. Like that was what was helpful, was I needed to go find somebody who was safe and kind. Yes. And could, Greg, like you said, not be shocked or say this is the worst thing ever. Mm-hmm. There is a safety in someone holding a space and having a presence like, okay, I'm with you in this. This is not too big. That is so helpful to find mm-hmm. a counselor that is not bowled over, but instead is educated and aware of these issues.
Good. What's something else that you hear is helpful?
Go for it, Beth.
Well, I think there are so many books out there about this topic, and we won't even go in to try to name, read this, don't read that. What I would say is we have heard both, I think, from each other's stories and with women that we've worked with, that getting educated about sexual addiction, about trauma, about betrayal, about helpful ways to move forward through books, through podcasts like this or others, through workshops. Basically, you want to fill your toolbox and really find good ways to equip yourself to move through this. You know, why would you know how to move through this, right? But there really are good resources out there. And along with that, I would say, if you find, if you're listening to something or reading something that, you know, your intuition is thinking, I don't think that's right. That just does not seem right. Like, part of what is helpful is learning to trust ourselves, right? And so listening to that inner voice and those holy whispers of God are so important when it comes to rebuilding our trust with ourselves.
And I would say, and again, this comes from the men's perspective, but a lot of times a man will say, the book or the therapist said what I wanted to hear. And what I knew, though, was that was not what I needed to hear. And I think we all have that intuitive knowing of, if this voice is just kind of giving us permission to stay where we are, there's not a challenge, there's not an invitation, then there's a part of us that may like it because it gives us permission not to do anything. But the reality is that's not what we need to hear. And so trusting ourselves and paying attention to what we are exposing ourselves to, I think, can be very important. It's not just gathering as much information as possible, but gathering the information that's going to serve us.
Yes. Another piece that was true for me that was really helpful is getting to know and having relationships with other women who also had a similar story. I know early on for me, when I first had that partial disclosure from Chris, I believed I must be the only one. I married the dud in the bunch. Like, of all the guys I could have picked, you know, like, well, how did I get the dud? But I had no idea that there would be other women who would be able to, and how do you find them? I'm like, how do you do that? You know, where do you just go to the coffee shop and just ask? And so when I came into Faithful and True and joined a women's group and went to the workshop, I mean, those were a couple of places where it was scary. It was hard at first to come walking into a room full of women, and then to start to share this vulnerable story, this hard story, and yet to know that you are not alone, that you don't have to walk through this alone, that other women can empathize and understand. It's just incredibly powerful. So I know for me, that was a huge part. Sorry.
Just to know there are other duds.
There's lots of other duds.
Yeah. You didn't get the only one.
You didn't get the only one.
Well, I would say that finding other safe women is huge. I mean, this is just really significant to know I'm not alone. I'm not crazy, right? But I would also say what's really helpful is other women who are on the journey of wanting to be well. We didn't mention this in the first not so helpful podcast, but I would say one of the things that's not so helpful is to be in communities with other women where it's just about husband bashing. And there's a sense of, I want to stay in this victim mentality. Have we been victims of betrayal? Yes, absolutely. And that's very different than having a victim-y mindset, right? And kind of digging in around that.
Bitterness.
So, yes.
Attempt.
Yes. I would say, again, part of listening to yourself is, do I like how these women in this group that I'm, say, attending, do I like how they're showing up? Do I like, how they're responding to other situations in their lives, the way that I see them, talk about things in group? That can be a really helpful thing, to be around other people who are wanting to be well.
Well, I would also say part of it is listening is their hope. You know, if you're in a group, and this is for men or women, if you're in a group and it doesn't seem like there's any hope and that your best bet is to endure, that may not be the group that you want to be a part of. That doesn't mean that a group doesn't talk about the difficulty. It doesn't acknowledge the pain. It doesn't, allow us to maybe even be victim-y. And that's not the nature of the group. That's not the culture of the group. The kind of the undergirding principle is hope, and there's a way forward. And there's hope either with or without the spouse, but there is hope, and that is being offered in the context of the group.
Yeah, another one here is slowing down the pace of life. I remember hearing that quite a few times throughout this journey of just the importance of slowing down, of really being able to learn to listen to those, what we kind of call those Holy Spirit nudges within us, to be able to pay attention to what we're feeling, to be able to respond versus react. I know just for me, having quiet time in my chair to journal, to cry, to talk to a safe friend was such an important piece. And I think if we're running life at 1,000 miles an hour and we're just going from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, it's difficult to do this work, to do the work of grieving, of kind of entering into that. Anything you'd say to that, Beth?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think you cannot be well without slowing down. And, one of the things that I would say, if you're listening and you're right in the middle of discovery and you're running at a really fast pace, get curious as to whether or not that may be a way that you are medicating the pain, which of course makes sense. And again, there's so much grace about that. And it's when we slow down that we begin to get in touch with our wise adult self. We begin to have awarenesses of how to make wise choices, what our choices even are, right? And so it will feel counterintuitive. Post-COVID, we're back, right? Like we're all running at high speed. And yet this type of a process will require us to find some space to step out of that intense speed.
And I want to validate, slowing down is scary. Because
really
slowing
is.
down means whatever we've been avoiding or denying begins to surface. It becomes more present. We become more aware of it. And so if you're listening and you're going, boy, that sounds scary, that's a good knowing that you're actually seeing this clearly, that there is a cost to slowing down and there is a cost not to slow down.
Yes, good way to say it. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I know I found really helpful is that I asked for a healthy separation. We call it a redemptive separation, or some call it a therapeutic separation. We actually didn't even have that language, did we, Greg? We didn't, quite know what we were doing. And yet we were listening to ourselves. I know I was listening to, I need the space. I did not know which end was up. Everything that I had known had been turned on its head. And we have other podcasts. For those of you that are listening and are wondering about redemptive separation, we have some other helpful podcasts in the archives about that. We have some things on our website about that. But I would just say, knowing that I could slow down and take a pause was so helpful. I did not know if Greg was going to choose to be well. And that gave me some really important space to tend to myself to get traction with my own work on this process, and from a healthy distance, kind of watch and see, would he be internally motivated to be well? And I'm very thankful the answer was yes. But that, I mean, I know we both, Greg, have said that was one of the things that really, really saved us. Like it put us on such a healthy course.
Well, and one of the things that a wife may say is what was helpful was detaching her journey from her husband's experiences or reactions. I mean, you know, I often say one of the best gifts you gave me early on was the gift of no hope, that I had no reason to believe that we were going to make it. Our marriage was not on the table as an option. And so it was in that reality that I had to determine if I was going to get well, for whom or why was I going to get well? And it gave me some clarity. And so, you know, for a wife that may be listening that feels like she has to process everything through the context of her marriage, one of the best gifts she may give herself and her spouse is to separate that out and let it be about her journey, figuring some things out, and then in that new understanding, determine what she's going to do with her marriage. Kind of like what we said earlier on, this idea of letting her make decisions about her marriage apart from what she's needing to take care of herself.
So I think it's just such an important choice, just to even know that it is a choice, because like we talked about in the first podcast, how it can feel like this pressure to make a huge decision of, am I in or am I out of this marriage? And I know for me as well, that's just like you, just having this space of a separation was like a timeout space of, I can't even think about that right now. I have no idea how to answer that big of a question. You know, we had 3 young children. I was a stay-at-home mom. I mean, there were a lot of things to consider of what's going to happen with this relationship. And it was really a gift. It was a gift to kind of surrender Chris, release him to himself for a little bit, to focus on my own healing, what I could control, get my feet in to this whole process of getting support for myself. And as you said, Beth, it takes time to see, to really listen to yourself, to kind of watch Chris and I say from across the room of what he was choosing, what was going on for him. And I would not have been ready early on to be able to really listen to myself and know what I should have chosen or would have chosen. And so I think it was a gift. Yeah.
Well, and one of the gifts for me in the separation was when Beth chose to move back towards me, I knew it wasn't out of obligation. And I didn't want a marriage of obligation. I didn't want Beth to stay with me because that was what she was supposed to do. I would have never used these words back then, but what I wanted was, if Beth were to come back, when that looked like more of a possibility, I wanted it to be about desire. And so we're talking about the idea of the wife, but there is a gift for this in the husband, when the wife gives herself space and then she can determine, I do want to move back towards my husband, and I want it to be out of desire, not fear, not obligation, not out of some sort of sense of duty.
Yes.
I think another really important thing that was very helpful, I began to recognize pretty early on that I didn't know how to grieve well. And I needed some help with that. And I'm so thankful I had a dear friend and mentor that could come alongside me and give me some tools for that. Some of it, like Elizabeth, you talked about finding some time to be quiet, just having a chair even that you could go to, journaling. All of that was really helpful for me. Another thing that I began to discover was that I could be sad, which isn't necessarily the same thing as grieving, I want to add. I didn't know that I had some core beliefs around anger. And didn't really feel like I had freedom to find my anger. And that was something I needed some help with. And it was really helpful to find some steps. It involved a lovely trip to the Goodwill and a box of old plates and, throwing some things against
you found that anger, it sounds like.
I did. And it was so helpful to find a healthy way to viscerally get that out of my body. And then I was able to have a conversation. There was many conversations with Greg about it. But I guess I just want to say, for those of you listening, if you think, I don't even know where to begin with this feels like this is so big, it feels like it's on top of me, be so kind to yourself, have grace with yourself, and just, it's like the next right step of figuring out, okay, how do I find healthy, safe ways to express this anger? How do I find healthy ways to move through this grief? And that's where a really good therapist, good counsel, good mentor comes in. I started to say comes in handy. It's not just handy, it's like necessary.
Well, and I would add, what's true is you wrote a book that was a resource that you could have benefited from in the early days. So if you're not aware, Beth wrote a book about loss and grief, and it's about what loss can teach us. In fact, that's the name of the book. And it comes out of her own experience in the betrayal and how she navigated that. But it's not just about that. It's about loss in general. And so if you're listening and you're looking for a resource about grief and connecting to anger, I would encourage you to look up Beth's book, What Loss Can Teach Us, as a great resource. I know there are a lot of women's groups that have been using that. And I think it's incredibly helpful because it is kind of a primer. It's an introduction, especially for women that aren't familiar with grief or don't have access to their anger, just to get some movement in that area.
And this just in, it's available in the store at faithfulandtrue.com. We didn't even plan that. That's awesome. Well, Beth and Elizabeth, we can't thank you enough for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. It's been great having you on with us again. And I just know that from you sharing your experience and your wisdom. And so we thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate what you come up with, making these points so easy to understand and relevant. We hope that the coming week for you, as you're out there, will be filled with many blessings and with great vision. Thanks, everybody.